Okay, well, it's the top of the hour, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome you. I am Tom Romito, and I am a board member of the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and I'm your host tonight. And my co-host is Julia Hinka. She's also on the call. The Friends Group is a 501c3 nonprofit celebrating our 25th year, supporting Ohio's only national wildlife refuge complex with youth development, public use projects, and most recently, land acquisition and restoration. We're located along the southern shore of Lake Erie near Oak Harbor in some of the most critical wetland habitats in the world. If you're interested in learning more about us and what we do, we're going to put a link in the chat room in just a moment. And this link will point you in the right direction to become a member, make a tax-deductible donation to support our work, or even shop on our online nature store, which my co-host Julia runs, by the by. Also, that link is your pathway to future virtual programs. We're going to do about 2 a month. The next one happens to be scheduled for June the 2nd. So you'll be able to see our presenter coming up online as we get closer to that date. So tonight we are joined by Eugene Braig, and he has graciously joined us today to share his program. Here is a thumbnail sketch of what he's going to talk about: a discussion of aquatic species in the Great Lakes region. He'll cover some history of these species in North America and the state, discuss regulatory managements, and in some ways in which volunteers can assist in managing these species. We'll finish by reviewing some species of concern that are recently on the move. Now, Eugene Braig is a fisheries biologist by training and applied-limnology jack of all trades in practice. And he's going to tell you what that means. I'm not going to try to tell you. He has a long list of credentials. He's a teacher. He's a program director for Aquatic Ecosystems at Ohio State University Extension. Fully embracing nerd status, he moonlights as a classical musician and serves as artistic director of the Columbus Guitar Society's concert series. Very good, Eugene. And without further ado, Eugene, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I do want to say this to you first, audience, that Eugene is amenable to fielding questions as we go. So if you have a question for Eugene on something he has just said, put it in the chat room and I will field it and wait for Eugene to pause and feed his question to you. If you're more comfortable waiting till the end, you're welcome to do that. It's up to you. Okay, Eugene, the show is yours, my friend.
Thanks for all, Tom. And Tom, I guess, promised that I would tell you what limnology means. So I guess we'll get that out of the way first. Limnology technically is the study of surface waters, waters that are contained within the continents. So the study of continental surface waters. If it's water on the surface and it's not an ocean, it's considered limnology. Now that is often kind of colloquially translated into lakes. The essence is I like lakes, and I like applying science to the management of lakes, especially if it involves fish, because I'm a fishy guy. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is aquatic invasive species in Ohio and the Great Lakes, and how you can involve yourself in some of the issues related to aquatic invasive species. Before I get into it, I want to offer a definition of aquatic invasive species. Right? So when I use the term invasive, I'm very deliberate in applying this kind of regulatory definition that was developed by executive order. That definition is a non-native organism whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human, animal, or plant health. Okay, so note that there are 2 important components to this definition. The first is that before I'm going to call an organism invasive, it has to come from someplace else. Right? It has to be not native to the place where I'm considering it. And it has to do something harmful to human interests, right? It has to have those two components before I'm going to refer to it as invasive. Now, perhaps if you're familiar, not every animal or organism or plant that is introduced to the landscape comes to be considered invasive. There are lots of non-natives that we do not consider invasive. Also, definitions vary a lot, right? Lots of people, depending upon their discipline, apply the terms differently. You might hear the terms invasive, you might hear non-native, you might hear nuisance, you might hear expanding, you might hear colonizer, right? There are lots of different terms. In this, for the purposes of this presentation, if I say invasive, I'm being very deliberate in saying a thing is from someplace else and is potentially harmful to some human interest. So an outline of what I'll cover today. We'll talk briefly about the history of aquatic invasive species in North America and especially in the Great Lakes region. We'll talk about the policy setting rather even more briefly because nothing is tedious like listening to me talk to you about policy. Then we'll talk about a committee in the state of Ohio that is charged with advising the state on managing aquatic invasive species. There's a short laundry list I'm going to introduce to you and this is very short, right? There are lots more species that are moving and concerning, but I'm going to give you a handful of things that I'm particularly concerned about because they're recently moving and doing stuff. And then I'll give you some resources for information and talk about how you can get involved. But let's start by talking about a brief history of aquatic invasive species. Okay, and so I'm going to break this down to several eras, the first of which began in 1800, right, when the nation was new, and ended not until about 1950. And I've labeled this the era of indiscriminate stalking and careless releases, right? When, in essence, people who were managing the aquatic resources of North America were just putting stuff hither and yon because they thought it would be cool. Does anybody know what the first documented, established aquatic non-native species was in North America? What was the first species to be released to North America and establish populations in the water?
A listening audience, Eugene is floating a question to you, and he's hoping that one of you will actually provide an answer. And you can do that very simply by pressing down your space bar, which will unmute you, and you can speak to him. If you're brave enough to do that, you're welcome to do it. Or you can put it in the chat room and I'll see your answer.
I'm responsive to either writing or hey, Amanda Miller scored it right out of the gate. So much to my surprise, not everybody gets this one right. Amanda did, and very quickly. It is indeed goldfish. Right? And goldfish were first reported collected from the Hudson River from a population in the 1600s. Early in this stretch, we've got the U.S. Fish Commission. This was a federal agency that later evolved into a couple of different things, primarily the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they engaged in this massive nationwide effort to stock fish. Early efforts, in essence, they looked at things in the interior of North America, right, where people hadn't colonized as quickly as they had on the coasts. They saw native fisheries, and they didn't recognize the value of native fisheries because they hadn't been exposed to them for as long. So they began stocking European things in these in our inland waters because they understood European things like brown trout and common carp, etc. They also, having colonized coasts first, they looked at things on the coasts and said, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had Atlantic species in the Pacific and vice versa? And so they started moving things from coast to coast without much thought to what might work, how it might disturb communities, thus the indiscriminate stocking bit. In addition, right, this is before we had the railroad era, at least at the beginning of it, we built canals. In order to move industrial goods around, we dug trenches in the water, and we dragged barges around with mules. And in digging those trenches to connect water bodies, that provided a connecting waters by which potentially invasive species could move themselves. Anybody have any idea what this is? You don't get any points from me if you say that's a train, right? So What do you think this thing might be? Any guesses? Type, talk. I'm happy to receive any of your guesses. I'll give you just a couple seconds to stew on it. Just a couple. Well, hearing no response, I will reveal to you that this is a U.S. Fish Commission fish car. Right? There was a fleet of these things on our rails shortly after the railroads were developed. Right? It would roll into town. You could show up with your milk can full of water and get your stash of carp. Maybe this fish car would drive over a trestle and see a beautiful, pristine river and say, hey, man, this river needs some carp. And they would set a bunch of carp loose, right? They use these to move fish around and stock them across North America. And the last one that was in operation was running until 1947, right? The last one wasn't decommissioned until 1947, which is why, in part, we end that era of indiscriminate stocking with 1950, right about that time. The next era ended about 1975, and this was the era of improved transport, shipping, and aquaculture escapes, right? So we had World War II. World War II, we developed a lot of new technologies, and those new technologies started to trickle into the private sector, especially fishing and shipping. And with the increase in volume of shipping, we started to move things around. If you're not familiar with big ocean-going vessels, for example, they have ballast tanks. They're built to carry mass, right? And if they're not loaded with cargo, they float too high in the water to the point that they're dangerous, right? They might capsize. So they need to carry mass. So if they don't have cargo, they take on what's called ballast, mass. Really old ballast was stone. In modern times, we use water. We pump water into ballast holds of big ships. And if you take on a bunch of water, for example, in an Eastern European freshwater port, and you cross the Atlantic Ocean and you enter the Great Lakes, you discharge that ballast water, you have the potential to move aquatic invasive species in those tanks from one place to another. You've probably heard of Asian carps, which is, that term itself is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I won't dwell too much on it. They began escaping from our hatcheries within this era. And we began to recognize the spread of disease often attached to the animals that we were stocking deliberately. Sometimes they had hitchhikers in the form of parasites and disease. Moving into the current era, and we'll call this the era of unauthorized introductions and increased shipping volume, right? These big cargo ships have gotten massive and they started moving a lot of stuff. But we've curbed problems associated with those to a great extent, and I'll talk about why soon. What has substantially increased, though, is people buying organisms as either pets or ornamental for example, a water garden or an aquarium. And rather than disposing of them properly, they will sometimes, if they get tired of keeping these organisms, they will release them to the wild, or perhaps they aren't very good stewards and they escape to the wild of their own accord. We've also had an increase of shipments of live things to ethnic food markets. So all of these things have increased, but as you'll see, invasions to the Great Lakes haven't necessarily responded in kind, because we have taken some very effective actions in recent times. Common pathways of introduction. I'm just going to give you a few highlights of regional importance. I've already discussed ballast water in pretty good detail, right? Good detail. So shipping, especially when we're talking about big cargo ships that have to take on ballast to be safe. Barrier removal, things like canal construction. Highway ditches are functionally artificial wetlands and often are corridors that allow aquatic invasive plants to move all across the landscape in association with highways. This is also the downside of dam removal, and we keep some dams in place. For example, I can't even think of the name of the dam on the Grand River, where there's an old mill dam on the Grand River that is kept there to prevent sea lamprey, an invasive parasitic fish, from moving up the Grand River. Intentional authorized stocking to introduce once desired species. When I talk about authorized, of course, I'm talking about stocking by agencies. That has largely dried up in recent times, fortunately, because we're better at recognizing potential problems. And also anything that we might have wanted to move, we've probably already moved. And people's opinions of those things that were once desirable sometimes changes. Things like common carp. And accidental and unauthorized releases, which I've already touched on a little bit, including those aquarium or ornamental species that sometimes people release carelessly. Also, though, keep in mind that if you launch a boat and it picks up some zebra mussels, or maybe you've got scraps of aquatic plants hanging off a boat trailer and you take that to a different body of water, that's also a pathway that could move an invasive organism from one body of water to another. I won't dwell too long on scientific literature, but there are some really good figures from this recent paper by Rochelle Sturdivant. She works up in Michigan. This is really an update to an older paper by an author named Mills. And in essence, it gives a really detailed history of invasive species to the Great Lakes. What I really want you to take from this graph is that far and away, most of the invasive organisms we're talking about within the Great Lakes are plants. The other thing I want, and you'll see this date, 1993, she drew that line because that's when the big paper by Mills came out, was in 1993. So that was really comprehensive at the time. This paper by Rochelle Sturdivant is in essence an update. And what's happened since, so the newer introductions are largely microbes and crustaceans. And that's in part because we're better at looking for them with better equipment, with better microscopes. A lot of the crustaceans involved here are going to be tiny zooplankton, right? Really small organisms that probably look like no more than a speck to the naked eye. She's categorized non-native introductions of organisms over time. Here I want you to notice at the bottom, these are organisms that we might consider invasive, right? So both non-native and something that has the potential to cause harm. And you'll see that about a third of these non-native organisms that have been introduced to the Great Lakes have become established in a way that we consider harmful, right? So about a third of these non-natives are what I would call invasive. Also notice that those that are strictly beneficial is that vanishingly tiny bit of green at the very top of this figure. Tiny, right? So it's very rare that we introduce an organism that is strictly beneficial. And then breaking it down by time, wherever you see a really steep slope, wherever that curve increases sharply, that is considered to be an era where there were more introductions than the time around it. This first era was, again, dominated by those deliberate introductions and the building of canals that ultimately bypassed Niagara Falls to connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean directly, and also allow the introduction of things by themselves so they could recruit themselves. The next era was mostly human introductions, both deliberate and unintentional. The last era, the next era followed the modernization of the St. Lawrence Seaway, which really expanded those canal connections between the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean in the end of the 50s to allow those really big ocean-going vessels into the Great Lakes. And then we had this long stretch of time by which ballast water and other canal invaders were able to get into the Great Lakes. Here I'm going to zoom in a little bit just on recent times, right? So this is shortly after that St. Lawrence Seaway was modernized. And I want you to notice here that problems have pretty much leveled off in the last 25 years. And this is largely because we require ocean-going vessels now to exchange their ballast water. So if they originated in a freshwater port, across the ocean, before they can enter the Great Lakes, they have to discharge their fresh water in the ocean from their ballast tanks. Then they have to draw salt water into the ballast tanks. So if there are any freshwater organisms that are suddenly flooded with salt water, they're going to be killed. And that was very effective at ending ballast as a vector of invasive species. The effects of aquatic invasive species. So there was a prestigious economic firm that conducted a study recently. This was sponsored by the Nature Conservancy, where they tried to analyze the cost of dealing with aquatic invasive species. And this is competition of trying to keep them out, cleaning up zebra mussels, loss because people perceive them as a detriment to water quality and thus are less likely to spend recreational money. So it tried to encapsulate all of these issues related to aquatic invasive species. They determined that the Great Lakes region loses more than $100 million a year in detrimental effects from aquatic invasive species. Regarding potential harm to the environment, I can think of, for example, if a new invasive species preys upon natives or parasitizes natives, they are stealing energy from that population of natives. They might compete with our natives, which is preventing energy from getting to our native populations. They can disrupt habitat function, like a zebra mussel. Let's say we've got soft substrate with a bunch of fish that like to live on soft substrate, and all of a sudden over time, but rather rapid time, is colonized with the bed of zebra mussels. It's very substantially changed how that substrate functions. Or an invasive plant, I'll show you a good example of a really dramatic change in habitat function because of an invasive plant later. If the organism is closely enough related to some of our natives, it might actually cause some just genetic disruption by interbreeding, by hybridizing with some of our natives. And then there's some trophic cascade effects. The one I'm going to talk about, well, let's talk a little bit about mobilizing historic contaminants. So for example, PCB is a good one. PCB are industrial chemicals. They haven't been used in decades. They've been disappearing from problem in Great Lakes waters for a great many years, until we had the zebra mussel invasion, right? They sit down in the sediment where the PCBs are being buried, being sequestered away from living things until the zebra mussels settle in there. Their zebra mussels are very fatty tissue. They take up those PCBs, and then comes the round goby, which eats the zebra mussels. And they're easy to eat, to catch if you happen to be a fish, a predatory fish, like a smallmouth bass. So smallmouth bass start eating round gobies that are eating zebra mussels. And every level up that food web, the toxins concentrate more intensely, right? That's called biomagnification. So after the introduction of round gobies, after they became widespread in Lake Erie, PCBs and smallmouth bass tissue tripled on average because of that new pathway that allowed those historic contaminants to mobilize back into the food web after they've been lost from the food web. But the real big potential changer is shifting the flow of energy up a food web, right? So here's this classic food pyramid, right? All of the living energy originates in the sun, and then before it becomes alive, you need something green to turn that solar energy into living stuff. And when we're talking about the water, the most important stuff is algae, right? So the algae take the sunlight, they turn it into living things. Then you get the little bugs, the plankton that eat the algae, and then you get the little fish that eat the little bugs, and you get the big fish that eat the little fish. And ultimately it culminates in things like big fish that people value. Well, you've probably heard of a predatory fish called a snakehead, right? A snakehead operates up here, right? It's way up at the tip of the pyramid. And it can have some effects on the organisms around it, right? A snakehead might suppress the little fish. But think about something like a zebra mussel or a silver carp, if a silver carp gets in. Things that are really effective at eating plankton, right? Things that are really good at making less of this algae available. So if you get a situation like that, which a lot of people don't think about because they don't have big photogenic teeth, but you get the zebra mussel in there, they thin the availability of algae, and they have the potential to limit the flow of energy all the way up to the top of the food web, which ultimately makes less fish that are valuable to people. So the value of fishing is tremendous to the Great Lakes. Estimated expenditures to the Great Lakes are about 30 billion total. For North America, about 2.2 billion spent to access the fisheries of the Great Lakes and buying equipment and buying gasoline and using local hotels. A tremendous economic driver to the Great Lakes. And if you estimate the entirety of that industry, it has an economic impact on the businesses around it of about $7.1 billion. So I don't like the notion of posing a threat to that in any way. So let's talk quickly about the AIS policy setting. Here are a whole bunch of federal regulations. They're going to be administered by 20 US agencies with diverse and often very specific authorities. They're often wrangling to pass those responsibilities off to other agencies. It's a big, complicated mess, and you definitely don't want to hear me talk about every one of these in tremendous detail. I will, however, dwell just a little bit on the National Invasive Species Act, because the National Invasive Species Act has created an entity called the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, which is this interagency federal entity that is charged with managing aquatic invasive species. So the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force, they implement the Invasive Species Act by developing programs to prevent introduction and dispersal of invasive species, to monitor, control, and study them, to conduct research related to their expansion, and to coordinate programs and activities among all of the agencies that participate. Regarding all of what they do, they're also charged with educating and informing the public about related issues. Now, the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force is a big federal cumbersome entity, and because they can't know everything, they are advised by regional panels. So you can see this breakdown of regional panels in this kind of blown up map. Ohio has representation on 2 of those panels. Of course, we send representatives to the Great Lakes panel, which is largely which is housed by the Great Lakes Commission, and to the Mississippi River Basin Panel, which is the biggest of those panels. Ohio's representatives are a guy named John Navarro, who works for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife. He, as the guy in Ohio charged with worrying about aquatic invasive species programming, he's Ohio's official primary representative on both panels, both the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River Basin panels. We have alternates. Tori Gabriel with Ohio Sea Grant is our alternate to the Great Lakes panel, and me. I'm our alternate to the Mississippi River Basin panel, and coincidentally, I'm also the current chair of the Mississippi River Basin panel. Regarding state management, that largely falls to state agencies that are charged with managing or regulating natural resources. So within Ohio, again, that's the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife. And they maintain a comprehensive management plan. In maintaining that comprehensive management plan, they qualify for some funding through the Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force to help manage invasive species issues. Now, this management plan receives stakeholder input through an informal advisory committee. So let's talk quickly about that informal advisory committee. And every once in a while, you'll see me provide a link. Don't worry too much about scratching these really complicated URLs down. The one link you should keep in mind to get is my email address, because if you want any of this stuff, drop me a line. I'm happy to get it to you. So we have an Ohio Aquatic Invasive Species Committee, which is an informal advisory service to the programs of the state of Ohio, especially the Division of Wildlife. We typically meet twice a year, every spring and fall, but of course, 2020 through 21, we're not typical. We're just now getting back into the swing of our routine meetings. We held one in the fall. We're planning it for another one in spring, so we're getting back into that kind of 2-meeting-a-year routine. The mission statement of that committee: to provide a forum for Ohio's diverse stakeholders, its resource management agencies, and related industries and organizations to advise the state about the prevention and control of aquatic invasive species, and for the state to inform those stakeholders about developing issues and policy. So that is perhaps a mission statement that was obviously generated by a committee. I drafted something that is a little less of a mouthful, but committees want to add every possible verb that might relate to what they're doing. Our membership is deliberately diverse and is largely hand-selected and recruited by myself and by John Navarro at the Division of Wildlife. There are representatives from state agencies as well as federal agencies that have operations within the state of Ohio, quasi-governmental entities, etc. Municipal park districts and zoos, municipalities participate on this committee. We have non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, the Ohio Environmental Council, etc. Industry representatives, especially representing shipping and fish farming, for example. and academics like myself. University of Toledo has pretty active representation here, Capital University, etc. Let me give you a quick laundry list of some recently on the move invasive species. So when we talk about non-native species, I've pulled these data from a database that I'm about to introduce later in the presentation. You can see here a number by different taxonomic category of things that are non-native that have been introduced to the state of Ohio, right? And that first number that you're going to see is a total number of species that are here from someplace else. That smaller number in parentheses are those things that are actually from North America, but not Ohio, and have managed to move into Ohio from other parts of North America, right? So I'm not going to read the numbers because reading numbers makes this talk even more boring than it already is. I will instead invite you to read the numbers yourself, ask questions about any of them if you have them. I will note that the number for fishes is very, very high, but not nearly as many of those are permanently established with populations in Ohio. Okay, these are just animals that have been captured in Ohio at any time. So plants, the first one is a submerged plant. It grows underwater called hydrilla, and it is kind of the bane of southern states. It's a terrible plant. It was first discovered on a piece of property that the Cleveland Metro Parks kind of inherited, and it got unfortunately moved around before they realized this plant had invaded. Then by the end of that first year of its first identification in Ohio, it was all along the Ohio waters of the Ohio River and has been moving into our south and east reservoirs because of careless boating. Right, so hydrilla is one that I definitely don't want to spread elsewhere in our Great Lakes waters. Fortunately, it seems to not be spreading into Lake Erie, but it's one that we need to keep our eye on. European frogbit. This one, the first reports that I had of it were in 2017 on Old Woman Creek, just a little bit east of the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. But one botanist told me that he'd collected it for years before up on the Lake Erie Islands. He just never told the world about it, right? So we'll talk more about frogbit soon. Yellow floating heart. Frogbit, by the way, looks like a very small water lily. We're talking very small. It has showy white flowers that are very pretty, but those flowers are about 1/2 inch or less across, and its leaves are about 2.5 inches or less across. So really tiny, like a tiny, tiny water lily. And you very well, if you spend time on the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, you've probably seen this. It's a recent and really explosive invader. Yellow floating heart is quite a bit bigger than European frogbit, but still smaller than our native water lilies. It first was introduced many decades ago and then stalled, but it's been recently on the move from about 2017 to 2019. It is not in Ohio's Lake Erie waters, but it is in some of the upper Great Lakes states like Wisconsin. And it's recently on the move in central Ohio. Once again, a plant that I don't want to see well established in Lake Erie. This one's particularly notorious because it forms really massive stands. The leaves cup, the leaves hold water, and so those small cups of water in their leaves become stagnant pools that are really good breeding grounds for mosquitoes. This thing can really amplify the population of mosquitoes. Pink lotus is one that's never been assessed because if you look at decades-old literature, they say there's not a chance that pink lotus is going to be able to establish in Ohio. But I know of 3 populations well established in Ohio in southern counties, and just recently another 2 reported in Delaware County, so the northern parts of central Ohio. Red swamp crayfish has been in Lake Erie watersheds for a long time, but it's been moving into other Lake Erie marshes and has recently encroached into central Ohio as well. Pond loach is an aquarium fish, a kind of eel-like wormy fish that Where it has had invasions in the Great Lakes, it tends to be in Lake Michigan and the upper Great Lakes. In Ohio, it's not been found in our Lake Erie waters yet. In Ohio, it's only been found on the south side of Columbus. Whether or not this one comes to be considered invasive is a bit unknown because it does things quite a bit differently from other fishes and doesn't really seem to get in the way of other fishes. So newly encroaching into the area, whether or not we call it invasive in the future, I'm not sure. And western mosquito fish, the epicenters of the western mosquito fish introduction were actually Denison University in central Ohio and Toledo, Ohio. They're stocked in order to eat mosquitoes, but in private ponds, for example. But the only advantage they have in doing so is that they happen to have mosquito in their name. There are lots of small native fish that are just as good at eating mosquitoes. So if you've got a small pond, fight the urge to stock mosquito fish, pick something native instead. One that I neglected to put on here is grass carp, and I really shouldn't have. Grass carp has been spawning consistently in the Sandusky River. When it was first documented and it was first found in 2012 in the Sandusky River after a really high water year in 2011, right? And I thought, we won't have another year like that maybe in 30 years. And if we don't create another grass carp spawn in 30 years, is that something I need to worry about? Probably not. Well, 2011, that spawned grass carp, and then it happened in 2015, 17, 19, 20, and 21. Our waters are getting higher later into the warm season, and it's getting warmer earlier. And so grass carp have the potential to become a real big problem. Grass carp are specialized herbivores. They eat plants. So if they get into our Lake Erie marshes, they have the potential to really damage the habitat. I'm tired of looking at text. I bet you are too. So here are some pictures. This is McGee Marsh, a place where I bird. So I was up there in 2018. I remembered seeing this largely as open water. You can see those big green leaves off in the distance. This is native water lilies. Then in 2019, the very next year, it looked like this. This is European frogbit, right? And so we had maybe some submerged plants growing under the water there. We had little bugs that like to hang out on the stems of submerged plants, fish that like to conduct their business in the light among the stems of submerged plants. This habitat is radically and completely different in only a year. Here's some shots of yellow floating heart in central Ohio. Again, that kind of smallish yellow, the flowers are really frilled. They almost look like lace. One of those stands of pink lotus in Delaware County, Ohio. Here is a red swamp crayfish that I shot at Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge a couple years ago. And these are the crayfish that are popular in Cajun food. They're a close relative of a native called white river crayfish, and they're really aggressive and large. So they have the potential to do a lot of damage to our native crayfish populations. And here it's been preserved, so the specimen's looking a little ratty, but this is a western mosquito fish that I collected on the refuge in 2020. Some resources where you might seek more information if this gets you fired up, if you're a nerd like me. So first off, the Ohio Division of Wildlife has the clearinghouse for things that they think are important regarding aquatic invasive species. And it's got one of the worst web addresses I've ever seen. Don't try to write that down. Once again, write down my email address. If you want it, I'm going to get it to you. There are several databases out there that I make some frequent use of, and the most important one is probably the U.S. Geological Surveys non-indigenous aquatic species database. If you go there and search for aquatic organisms that are invasive, you find a species, you click on it, it'll give you a really detailed fact sheet and range map that is updated almost in real time, right? Often they update days, within days of the last update. So this is a really good database full of a lot of useful information. This database seems to me the one that's mostly used by professional managers. U.S. Department of Agriculture maintains a plants database, which I also think is useful. Now, its range maps aren't nearly as good. They're not nearly as detailed, and I sometimes quibble about the way they categorize things on their range maps. I don't think it's perfectly accurate, but it's still quite good. And what's really useful about this is, for example, if I go looking for a wetland plant, there's a tab regarding regulations. If I click on that, it'll tell me about the regulations in every state, whether, for example, this wetland plant is considered endangered and is protected, or if it's invasive and illegal to move because it's invasive. So check out the plants database of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In addition, you'll note that they've got a wetland search. So somebody like me who's really only interested in aquatic things, I can refine my search to only look for aquatic plants. The Edmap system. Edmap stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. This is a great database. It is not just aquatic, right? Any invasive species could potentially go into there, including terrestrial things. And this one seems to me to be mostly used. It's very similar in function to the USGS database, other than the fact that it's terrestrial. And this one seems to be used more by academics, right? Scientists who work for universities, and citizen scientists. So people out in the field, volunteers who are members of friends organizations like you. This is the database they're more likely to use for some reason. And there's a way that you can interface with this database. I'll show you that way really soon. The last resource I want to talk about is this really handy Aquatic Invasive Species Field Guide, which is co-edited by me and my colleagues. You can download it electronically, but if I speak in person, I bring boxes of these things to give away for free. And you can find them, you could ask in your local Division of Wildlife office. They may have them for you there on hand, but if they don't have them, they can probably get them for you. So if you want this, check it out, a really handy field guide to help you identify aquatic invasive species in Ohio in the field. It also, each one is coded, so new invasions that are concerning have a little cell phone icon on the page for the species. And so if you see that cell phone icon, you find the species, you know to call the state to report it. Let's talk about how you can get a little more involved yourselves. So there are a couple of campaigns that I received grant money to talk about, so you get to hear about it now too. The first is the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers campaign. This is to provide a consistent message for those who engage in sport on the water, right? Those who boat, those who go fishing, etc. The simple form of that message is clean, drain, dry, right? So whenever you have, whenever you put a piece of equipment in the water, when you take it out of the water, inspect it for any debris or organisms hanging onto it and clean it off. Drain any water that might be in your minnow buckets, in your live well, in your bilge. Drain that water and then allow that equipment to dry before you move it to the next body of water, right? To help be good stewards and prevent the spread of these things. StopAquaticHitchhikers.org is the easy to remember website for that, so check that out. The other is the Habitatitude campaign. And this is a partnership between some government entities and industry, especially industries like nurseries and water gardens, shops, and pet stores. And it's to provide information to consumers of those organisms in trade to try to convince them to be better stewards and not release those things to the wild where they might become an invasive nuisance. So check out habitatitude.net as well. And if you're really fired up to get involved, I would encourage you to scan this code from your screen and install the Gedden app. Gedden stands for Great Lakes Early Detection Network. This is a smartphone app, right? So it has a nice little kind of a catalog of invasive species in it, both terrestrial and aquatic. So you scroll to the aquatic listing. You take a picture of the thing you've seen in the field. The app will flag the picture with the location and you can submit a report. That report, after it's been approved by professionals, and if it's an aquatic species in Ohio, I'm the guy who has to approve that report. So please take good pictures because is tired and doesn't want to drive out to confirm your report. So take a good picture. But those reports have to be confirmed by a professional before they are entered into the Edmaps database. But after they're confirmed, they go into that Edmaps database. Professionals can then use that database to monitor the spread of these things, to know where they are, to help fight against them with herbicide applications, for example, or whatever the method is to control them. I'm eager to take some questions, but the real purpose of this slide is that I like to look at pictures of myself with fish. And now you get to do so as well. Enjoy. And remember, I told you the one link you should write down is my email address. Hey, there it is. And I've reached the end. After having been asked to speak for 45 minutes, it's been exactly 45 minutes.
Well, Gene, thank you very much for that impressive program. I don't see any questions in the chat room, but so I would like to lead off with one of my own. I'm interested in the lamprey. Is that much of a threat in Lake Erie?
So the sea lamprey is an invasive fish, a very primitive fish, right? It doesn't even have pairs of fins. It only has a contiguous fin fold down the middle of the body. Has one nostril. It's so primitive it does not have any bones at all, no jaw. The only bony structures it has is teeth, right? And the sea lamprey, it conducts its business by its mouth is a suction cup full of teeth. It attaches itself to the side of a fish, grasps a hole in that fish and sucks out the juices, which is often lethal for the fish. Sea lamprey invasion into the 50s in particular caused the complete collapse of things like lake trout and whitefishes in conjunction with habitat degradation and overfishing. But the sea lamprey was a big contributor. And they really like things like lake trout and whitefishes that have really soft scales and are really oily. Now, the other Great Lakes tend to have, they spawn in streams, right? So they go out to the ocean or to the lake in order to grow up, but when it's time to make babies, they swim up into rivers to make babies. And Lake Erie doesn't have very good streams for their reproduction. The only streams that we have that are good for their reproduction are in the east of the state. So they were a problem here, but never as big a problem as they were on the upper Great Lakes. That said, right now, some of our species like lake trout or burbot, which is a freshwater cod, yes, we do have freshwater cod in Lake Erie, their numbers are very low. And if sea lamprey numbers increase, those numbers go lower, and that's not good for the natives, right? There was something else I wanted to say. Oh, sea lamprey. So Great Lakes wide, there's a program to actually apply poisons to the rivers to kill the baby lamprey before they come out to the lake. And on rotation, right, we have coordinated by the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. We have agency scientists going out and squirting poison in our rivers to deliberately kill baby lamprey. Now, the poisons are pretty selective. They don't influence many of our fishes, but they're really hard on our fishes that don't have scales, things like the very small catfishes like the mad toms, our native lampreys, which aren't a problem, and some of our native lampreys are endangered, and amphibians, right? So the poison is kind of selective, but not perfectly selective. So it's an imperfect solution. But if we stop, the lamprey come back.
Well, Eugene, thank you for that explanation. Rebecca Lewis asks this question: do you think the rapid spread of frogbit can be attributed to the increase in paddle sports, birds spreading between marshes, both or something else? So
thank you for that, Rebecca. And it's good to pseudo hear from you. It's been a while, right? That one's hard for me to answer. There is an interstate frogbit consortium that is working on this. The Ohio Coastal Office is very much involved, mostly with Sebastian Mejia. I'm surprised by how quickly it spread, because the conventional wisdom is that it mostly occurs in single-sex stands, so that sexual reproduction is relatively uncommon, which means seeds are less commonly the mechanism for it to reproduce than being broken off and moved around. So I think that it must have broken off and moved around, possibly facilitated by birds, possibly facilitated by paddlers, possibly simply facilitated by storms. So I'm not sure. I don't know if anybody's sure. If somebody is sure, it's likely to be Sebastian Mejia at the Coastal Office.
Thank you, Eugene. I want to stimulate more questions by asking you this one. If you covered this at the very beginning, please forgive me, but I'm interested in knowing how the invasives that you've covered, these different species, affect our native fish populations, such as perch and bass and walleye and so forth.
So it's going to be extremely variable depending upon what species we're talking about and what their habits are and how they might coincide, how they might interact with our native population. So for example, a grass carp, large grass carp, if we ever have a grass carp population established, it's likely to very severely damage any of our coastal marshes that are connected to the lake. And those coastal marshes are important spawning grounds for a lot of our native fishes, right? So things like yellow perch need to string their eggs on vegetation in order to reproduce. If grass carp destroy that vegetation, there is less opportunity to make more yellow perch. Something like a sea lamprey is a direct parasite. White perch is an invader that came in from the Atlantic Ocean. And in some times of year, white perch catch dominates commercial fish nets, right? So they might catch 40% of the fish in their nets. Almost half of all the things they catch might be white perch. And they are extreme competitors with a close relative, the white bass. Believe it or not, white perch and white bass are both bass species and the close relatives. White bass are much more rare because of direct competition from the close relative white perch. So it really depends upon which fish we're talking about and which of our native populations it's interacting with, but they certainly have effects. Once again, if we call it invasive, it's deliberately because it's doing harm to something we value.
Real fine. Well, thank you again. I see no other questions in the chat room. If anybody has something on their mind they'd like to ask Gene, you just simply press your space bar and speak to him, and he'll field your question himself.
I am at your service for as long as you're asking me questions. If you stop asking me questions, I'm going to eat some dinner.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to stay to the top of the hour by any means.
I'd still love your questions.
I know you do. And so hearing none, I simply want to remind you, audience, that our next program is scheduled for June the 2nd. It's going to be Laura Kammermeyer of Cornell University, and she's going to talk about birding. And something you can look forward to. Go to our website to catch that, to register for that. As the first week of June approaches. So thank everyone. I thank everyone for joining us. Please join us for our other events online, and we're going to be, the refuge is going to be open. The visitor center is going to be open during the biggest week of American birding. So please come out and see us, talk to us, maybe talk about becoming a Friends member.